What if the Vikings were never pure to begin with? That single question unsettles one of the most persistent myths in popular history. The idea that the Vikings were a biologically uniform people, blonde, blue-eyed, and isolated at the edge of Europe. Genetics now tells a far more complex and far more interesting story. What follows is a restructured, deeply expanded analysis designed for an American audience interested in archaeology, human history, and the hidden forces that shape civilizations. This is not a list of traits. It is a story about movement, contact, and how identity is formed through survival rather than purity. The Viking Age, stretching from the late 8th to the early 11th century, was never the story of a single nation, race, or empire rising in unison. It was the story of a choice. To go Viking was not to belong to a fixed tribe, but to take part in an activity raiding across open seas, trading along river networks, exploring unknown coastlines, migrating into new lands, and sometimes settling far from home. The men and women we now call Vikings came largely from Scandinavia, modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, but they did not move as a unified biological or political body. They moved as individuals, crews, families, and opportunists, bound more by circumstance than by blood. This distinction changes everything. When we ask what Vikings looked like, or what genes they carried, we are not peering into a sealed population preserved in time. We are observing a system in motion, a human current that absorbed outsiders, displaced local peoples, formed alliances, took captives, intermarried, and redistributed ancestry across vast distances. The Viking world functioned less like a bordered state and more like a network, porous, adaptive, and constantly reshaped by contact. From the very beginning, Viking identity was fluid. It expanded and contracted with opportunity, with survival, with the pull of the horizon. What defined a Viking was not ancestry alone, but action. Not where someone came from, but what they chose to do when they stepped onto a ship and left the shoreline behind. One of the most powerful explanations for the Viking expansion does not begin with ideology, religion, or a hunger for conquest. It begins at home, with numbers. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that early medieval Scandinavia may have faced a persistent imbalance in its operational sex ratio. Too many young men competing for too few women of marriageable age. In societies shaped by inheritance, status, and limited land, this imbalance creates tension long before it creates armies. When opportunity narrows, risk is pushed outward. Young men with little chance of securing land, wealth, or a family do not remain idle. Across history, they are the ones most likely to leave, to gamble, and to accept dangers others avoid. In the Viking world, this translated into voyages beyond the horizon, journeys undertaken not only for silver, but for survival in a social sense. Wealth meant status. Status meant marriage. And marriage meant a future. Seen this way, raiding was never just violence. It was a strategy, a way to bypass closed social systems at home by forcing open new ones abroad. Ships carried more than weapons. They carried ambition, desperation, and the hope of return as someone transformed. Through this lens, the Viking expansion no longer looks like a sudden cultural eruption or a uniquely aggressive mindset. It resembles a pressure valve, an outlet for demographic stress in a society where too many young men stood on the margins. The sea did not call them because they were born Vikings. It called them because, for many, staying meant having nothing at all. Most popular histories tell the Viking story as something that happened to others, to Britain, to Ireland, to the coasts of the North Atlantic. The ships arrive, the impact spreads outward, and Scandinavia remains the fixed point of origin. Genetics now forces us to reverse that perspective. During the Viking Age, Scandinavia itself was quietly but profoundly transformed. Large-scale ancient DNA studies show that between the 8th and 11th centuries, significant non-Scandinavian ancestry flowed into Scandinavia. Western regions received genetic input from Britain and Ireland, while Eastern Scandinavia absorbed ancestry linked to Baltic and Finnish populations. Even more striking, Denmark and southern Sweden show traces of southern European ancestry, modeled most strongly from Italy, a region geographically distant but economically connected. This pattern was not random. Genetic flows align closely with known Viking trade routes, following the same paths as silver, slaves, and goods. Where ships traveled repeatedly, people followed, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, but always leaving a biological trace behind. Seen this way, Scandinavia was never just the engine of Viking expansion. It was part of the circuit, a receiving ground shaped by return voyages, foreign marriages, enslaved individuals, and long-term settlement. The Viking Age did not simply export people and culture outward, it folded the outside world back in. Scandinavia, genetically speaking, was not only a source, it was a destination. One of the most uncomfortable, yet essential, truths of the Viking world is that it was built, in part, on slavery. This reality rarely fits the heroic image of raiders and explorers, but both historical records and genetic evidence point to its central role in shaping Scandinavian society. In some regions of Viking Age Scandinavia, enslaved individuals may have made up as much as 10% of the population, a proportion large enough to leave lasting biological and cultural marks. Many of these captives came from Britain, Ireland, and the Baltic regions. They were taken during raids, acquired through trade, or moved along the same routes that carried silver and goods across northern Europe. What makes this movement especially significant is what the genetics reveal beneath the surface. Much of this incoming ancestry appears to have been female-biased, particularly from the British Isles and the Eastern Baltic. That imbalance tells a quiet, deeply human story. Viking expeditions were overwhelmingly male. When these men returned, they did not come back alone. Women were brought into Scandinavia through enslavement, through coerced or negotiated marriages, and through forced relocation that gradually became permanent. Over time, these women were absorbed into households, raised children, and became part of Scandinavian family lines. Their presence was not marked by monuments or sagas, but by continuity. This is how genetics truly moves through history, not through the clash of armies or the rise and fall of kings, but through kitchens, cradles, and generations. The Viking world expanded on the surface through ships and violence, but it endured beneath the surface through women whose names were never recorded and whose legacy, written into DNA, still remains. So what did Vikings actually look like? Ancient DNA reveals a picture far quieter and more complex than the familiar image of uniformly blonde warriors. Genetic markers associated with light pigmentation, especially variants in the HERC2, OCA2, and TYR genes, were already common during the Viking Age. Blue, grey, and green eyes were widespread, and lighter hair appeared frequently. But frequency is not uniformity. Brown eyes existed. Darker hair existed. Variation was normal, visible, and expected. What matters most is not the presence of light traits, but their pattern. The distribution of eye and hair color in Viking Age Scandinavia closely mirrors that of modern Northern Europeans. This tells us something essential. The so-called Nordic look was not created by the Vikings, nor did it suddenly emerge in the medieval period. It was already established long before the first longships left the coast. The Vikings inherited these traits. They did not define them. There is, however, an important nuance. Genetic samples from Viking Age Denmark suggest a higher prevalence of darker hair than is seen among modern Danes. This may reflect southern European gene flow during the Viking Age, or later population shifts that reshaped Denmark after the medieval period ended. Either way, it reminds us that even within Scandinavia, genetics was never static. The conclusion is simple, but often resisted. There was no single Viking appearance, no fixed template, no biological uniform. The Vikings were shaped by movement, mixture, and time, and the farther we move from myth, the clearer that diversity becomes. The Vikings were not only raiders who struck coastlines and vanished, they were carriers of goods, of people, and of ancestry. Through wide trade networks reaching into Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Islamic world, Scandinavian and Northern European genetics traveled far beyond the North Sea, often without leaving written traces. A key partner in this network was the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad. Viking traders, moving along river routes through Eastern Europe, supplied enslaved Europeans to markets connected to the Muslim world. In return, they received silver coinage that flowed back into Scandinavia and helped sustain the Viking economy. Archaeology has long tracked this silver. Genetics now traces the human cost behind it. This exchange leads to a controversial but plausible hypothesis. Some light eye colors, especially gray found today at low but noticeable frequencies in parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, may reflect faint echoes of this medieval human movement. The claim is not that Vikings reshaped these regions, but that repeated, small-scale transfers of people over centuries can leave subtle biological signatures. Any such impact would have been heavily diluted by time and migration, yet genetics remembers what history often forgets. In that sense, Viking expansion did not end when the raids stopped. It continued quietly embedded in DNA, carried across continents not by conquest, but by connection. When genetics looks beyond stories of conquest, it asks a quieter question, not who ruled, but what endured. Along the paternal line, one Y DNA haplogroup stands out in the Viking world, I1IM 253. This lineage remains common in Scandinavia today and is closely associated with the long-term expansion of Germanic populations. Its survival across centuries suggests continuity rather than dominance, lines that persisted through social change rather than rising and falling with power. Other paternal lineages were also present during the Viking Age. Haplogroups such as R1A, particularly the R1AZ 284 subclade, and R1b appear among Viking Age remains, reflecting deep ancestral layers that predate the Viking period itself. Even on the male side, Viking genetics was never singular or uniform. The maternal story is even more revealing. Mitochondrial DNA from Viking Age women shows a wide range of lineages shared across Northern and Western Europe, alongside rarer haplotypes that are uncommon in Scandinavia today. This diversity points to movement, marriage, and integration both outward and inward. Genetic evidence increasingly suggests that women were central agents of Viking expansion and settlement. Both Scandinavian and foreign women helped establish lasting communities, especially in places like Iceland, where survival depended on families rather than force. Through childbirth and continuity, they anchored Viking presence long after expansion ended. Empires are remembered through men. Populations endure through women. When we zoom far enough out, Viking genetics no longer appear as the product of a single age. Instead, they resolve into something much older. Beneath the movement of the Viking period lie three deep ancestral layers. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who first adapted to the northern landscapes. Neolithic farmers who reshaped Europe through agriculture. And Bronze Age pastoralists whose mobility left lasting genetic traces. The Viking Age did not create this mixture, it inherited it. What is striking is how durable these layers remained. Even during centuries defined by travel and contact, genetic structure within Scandinavia stayed strongly regional. Norwegian-like, Swedish-like, and Danish-like clusters were already visible during the Viking Age and continue to shape modern populations today. Movement occurred, ancestry flowed, yet older patterns persisted beneath the surface. This challenges the idea of the Viking world as a melting pot where differences dissolved into uniformity. Instead, it functioned like a braided river, multiple currents moving side by side, sometimes merging, sometimes separating, but never losing their distinct paths. The Vikings were not the beginning of a genetic story, but one chapter within a much longer human continuum, where deep ancestry endured even as history moved forward. If genetics teaches us anything, it is this: identity is not preserved by isolation. The Vikings did not spread because they were biologically uniform. They endured because they were adaptive, absorbing people, knowledge, and traits wherever they went. What survived was not Viking blood, but Viking continuity. At Prehistoric Shadows, we do not ask who the Vikings were supposed to be. We ask what endured when the raids ended, the ships rotted, and the names were forgotten. Because history is not written by purity, it is written by survival.